Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth and final Lunch and Learn for Baltimore Data Week. We still have some groups coming in from the wait room, so we're just going to wait a minute until traffic calms down a little bit. But I do want to welcome you all today to this presentation. So just sit tight for just one moment and we'll get started soon. All right, I'm watching the waiting room and I think we've sort of slowed down a little bit and I've got a lot to cover today. So I'm going to get started with this and get going. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fourth Lunch and Learn for Baltimore Data Week. This is the presentation on Vital Signs 21, the State of Baltimore Neighborhoods. As you can see up on our slides today, this is a part of a larger full week, Baltimore Data Week, and it's culminating in our in-person event tomorrow at the University of Baltimore. We start bright and early at 8:30 and then go to about 3:15, 3:30. We have closed registration for this event at this point, but if you have not yet registered and are really hoping to attend, shoot us an email and we will see what we can do. So I'm just going to jump right in. So as I mentioned, this is the presentation on the Spring 2023 Vital Signs 21 report. Vital Signs 21 looks at the year 2021, and as such, it's really the sort of first year of recovery following the COVID-19 pandemic. So some of the indicators that we're going to get into today, I think really illustrate some of the ways that the city has struggled during the pandemic and the ways that we're recovering. So first, I want to introduce myself. I know you might have seen me on some calls earlier this week, or perhaps we've met in person, but my name is Amanda Phillips DeLucas, and in March of this year, I stepped into the role of director at the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. I've lived in Baltimore now for just over 5 years, and I've lived in Baltimore for just over 5 years. I did my PhD in a field called science and technology studies. And when I was doing that, I was researching the relationship between highway building, community participation, and specifically how did community groups use scientific and technical data to inform highway protests in the 1960s and 1970s in Baltimore. Following that, I started a postdoctoral fellowship with the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies and in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service. And from there, I was studying perceptions of green infrastructure in Baltimore City. These are topics that I could talk about forever and ever, but this is not the place for that. But if you're interested, feel free to reach out because, again, I can talk for days. So today we're going to give a high-level overview of some of the indicators that stood out from the Vital Signs 2021 report. Again, this is a really high level overview. We're not going to get too in depth on any specific one community today, but if you are sitting here today and you have a question about a particular community or a particular census tract or even a particular council district, let me know. I can prepare a presentation that goes much more in depth. So we're going to start today actually with a little bit of a refresher. What is BINIA? Who are we? And then sort of how do we make these indicators? And I'm doing this today for two reasons. Number one, I'm very new to this role. I'm still learning our language, I'm still learning our processes, and I'm still learning our methods. So I want to make sure that those are clear to you as I'm learning about them as well. So what is BINIA? So BINIA stands for the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance at the Jacob France Institute. We're located at the University of Baltimore, and we are a one-stop shop for comprehensive data indicators and training. We look at multiple topics, which we're going to dive into across the city of Baltimore. And importantly, we store longitudinal data. So we've got data all the way from 2000 to now 2021. Our mission as an institution is to provide accessible, reliable, and actionable data and indicators about, for, and with Baltimore City and its communities. We are also a member of the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership at the Urban Institute. This is a cohort organization that brings together groups much like BINIA. Not all of them look at neighborhoods. Some of them look at specific topic areas like community health and sort of leverage different data sources in order to enact change. So this might seem like a really basic question, but it's one I think worth exploring. And what is data in particular? And how does BINIA use it? So we are more of a warehouse, a repository, or an intermediary for specifically administrative data sets. And I think it's kind of important to think about, like, how is data organized? So broadly, and we could get in the weeds on this, but not today, is all data sets share three common themes. They create equivalencies, they develop categories, and they code individual phenomena into categories. Now, why is this important? So we are not data creators. We are not the ones sort of building spreadsheets for the most part. We're not the ones classifying data. So for instance, let's dive into this little template that I have on the slide right here. So a primary data set that's used in vital signs is Part 1 crime numbers. These are incidents of crime that reported in Part 1 are considered the most serious offenses. By organizing serious offenses into a single type, this data set makes many types of crime equivalent. There are two categories within Part 1 crime that BINIA analyzes, including property crimes and violent crimes. And then different types of crime are then coded into each category. So for instance, burglary and auto theft are subcategories of property crime. So why does data classification matter? So first, while data points represent a certain count of an occurrence, the systems that classify data shape what we understand about the event. These classifications inform what indicators BINIA can develop and track annually. And second, classification systems are created through interpretive work. Sorting data into categories requires human judgment. So ultimately, we collect and warehouse data from both public and private sources. We can only develop the indicators using the data classifications provided to us. So if you're reading your report or you're on our website, you're going to find numerous descriptions of the data sources we use, their limitations, their strengths, how we can compare them. And we include this for transparency and to recognize that while our indicators point to events within neighborhoods, ultimately, we don't really control how that occurrence gets counted. So here is a word cloud. This is all of the sources that BINIA uses in order to generate indicators. The bigger the word, the more often it is used in the vital signs report. So we use census data a lot. This helps us get demographics. We use the American Community Survey, which is it's a tool that goes out to houses across the US. We use that a lot. We use city schools, Baltimore Police Department, vital statistics, housing. We take data from all across the city and sort of what's given nationally to build out our indicators. And then there's this question of how do we measure neighborhoods as an institution? So we use a geographic unit called a community statistical area, or a CSA. And CSAs are a unit specific to BINIA. They're clusters of census tracts, which are itself geographic units of measurement that correspond to Baltimore neighborhood boundaries. Now, neighborhood lines do not perfectly match with CSAs, but they often stand as representations of conditions that may occur within particular neighborhoods. So finally, what is an indicator? So indicators are measures or a set of measures that help to quantify or express progress towards a goal. You go on our website, That's the definition that you'll see. The second definition I've put on the slide today is I've described indicators as a knowledge technology that can be used to quantify, compare, and rank virtually any complex field of human affairs. Now, that second definition, it's a little wonky, it's a little academic, but I think it's really important to sort of think of indicators as a technology. They're something that people use. They're a tool to help us set goals, to help us understand our environment. And I think it's really important that we think of indicators as active tools that help us make sense of our world and of our neighborhoods. Then you might be asking, well, how do we use these indicators? How do we use these data points? So there's a lot of ways that people have used BINIA data in general. One way is in local planning processes. So neighborhoods, local, regional plans, they include indicators to monitor, track, and evaluate the efficacy of plan implementation. Our indicators are really good at looking at trends longitudinally. Community-based organizations or nonprofits frequently use our indicators in grant writing. If you're looking to understand the neighborhood conditions of one of our many community statistical areas, that's one great way to use our indicators. And I'm going to give a shout out to our partners at the library who gave a great presentation yesterday on grant writing and sort of showed exactly how you can plug those indicators in to a grant proposal document. And then finally, indicators can be used for advocacy. They can be useful in sort of shaping arguments, in preparing public testimony, in submitting comments, or movement building activities. All right, we're going to dive into vital signs right now. And I want to be very clear, as I said in the beginning, this is a very high level overview. We have over 110 individual indicators that we track year to year. And I unfortunately could not give a presentation on 110 indicators today. So what I've done is I've sort of chosen indicators that stood out to me. So the first time I'm writing this report and I'm working with the BINIA team to see what's going on. So I chose indicators that stood out to me. I also tried to choose indicators that I think demonstrate either recovery or some challenges we're facing as we continue to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, this is not our full list, and I'm happy to dive into a subject matter that might interest you or your group at a different time. My door is always open that way. And I also need to acknowledge our sponsors here. Vital Signs would not be possible without the sponsorship of the Annie E. Casey Foundation and the other sponsors who are listed on our list today. All right. Oh, and one other thing before we begin. I've broken out the rest of this talk by topic areas. We are not going to be discussing the children and family health and well-being indicators today. We are still waiting on a good amount of data for that chapter and just haven't put it out as of yet. So with that being said, we're going to skip over that. It doesn't mean that we won't report out on these numbers eventually. We're just still waiting on some data. Okay, so to back up just a little bit, in 2020, the decennial census took place. And I think this will be familiar to many people who are on the call. But Baltimore showed continued population loss, and we lost over 5.7% between 2010 and 2020. This was, as we'll go into a bit on the next slide, not a common trend for cities of our size. We saw a lot of growth in urban and metropolitan areas, especially in the North, East, South, and Southwest. More recent releases from the Census Bureau estimate that in 2022, Baltimore lost an additional 7,000 residents. Now, we don't really know exactly what's causing that population loss. There could still be some pandemic effects, some ruralization going on, but broadly, we're still seeing this downward trajectory of population within the city of Baltimore. Another sort of point on other releases that are emerging from the census is over the coming months, we'll be updating our website with the newly released demographic and housing characteristics file from the 2020 census. They're not up on the website yet. We know that it's been released. We're working towards it, and we'll let you know when that's on our website. So as we can see from this diagram, East Coast cities were really winners in terms of population gain between 2010 and 2020. You can walk your way down the I-95 corridor and see huge growth in Newark, in Boston, Providence, New York, Philadelphia, DC, and Richmond. So Baltimore really stands out amongst that. We are a major East Coast city, and yet we saw such a huge decline in population. But we also know, and as Binia documented before I arrived in the Community Change Project, that population change in the city has been happening well before this most recent census from 2000 to 2010, and then from 2010 to 2020, and really even until we go back until the 1970s or so. So we have a long downward trajectory on population in the city. But what this 2020 census really made clear is that population decline isn't happening evenly in our cities. It is as we go east and west, and in our majority Black and majority low income neighborhoods, we are seeing greater declines of population. And we can sort of see from this chart that some areas of the city are really, really growing. Downtown Seton Hill, South Baltimore, Greektown, Highlandtown, Fells Point, and then other parts of the city are really declining, sometimes as much as 29%. So that's Sandtown, Winchester, or Southwest Baltimore, Clifton Berea, or Midway Coldstream. So we have that chart up there, and the previous director, Binia Seema Iyer, pointed this out as divergence, that we're continuing to see a growing apart of our neighborhoods. And within that divergence, we can see these trends play out in other indicators. And so I just sort of went through and looked at some of our longitudinal data just to sort of see how these trends play out so for instance, on the screen right now is the percent of households that earn less than $25,000. So up at the top, anywhere between sort of 30% and 52%. So that's percent of households earning less than 25,000 in a given community statistical area. Those are all the neighborhoods that have experienced population decline. And then we see the population growth sort of downward trajectories of households earning less than 25,000 or sort of staying around the same areas. So we see positive trends in the neighborhoods where we experience growth. And then we also see that in terms of households who are earning more than $75,000 a year. So in the areas where we saw population growth, there are more and more households who are sort of earning at that upper income level bracket. And then on the other side, and where you see population decline, those sort of trend lines are much more condensed. You're not seeing as much mobility within the neighborhood, and you're not seeing growth sort of longitudinally. And I thought this was a really interesting graph to pull out to sort of show this trend. And this is number of new construction permits per 1,000 residential properties, 2011 to 2021. So you'll see that in Highlandtown, in Greektown, in in South Baltimore, you see a lot of new construction permits were pulled in that sort of 2014, 2015 timeframe. Some of these are residential permits that are pulled, but we sort of see that there was an action that took place that made it possible for population growth to happen in one area. So these are conscious decisions. There's intentionality going on here, that we're not locked into population change, that there are actions that can be taken within different communities to increase the population, to sort of build community capacity and enhance community health. But we need to sort of think of the changes that are going on are not locked in. And there are things that we can do to change the trajectory of neighborhoods. So now that we're sort of done with the sort of 2020 census wrap up, I want to move into sort of broader census demographics. So during 2017 and 2021, we're seeing a an increase in the percentage of the Hispanic population in the city of Baltimore. So we're growing the diversity of our city. Some CSAs like Southeastern, and Orangetown, East Highland Town, we're seeing increases in the Hispanic population between 31% and 30%. We're expanding the diversity of our city, and that's really exciting. It's really exciting. I think the other thing that these points out and this neighborhood change points to is how can we target services to those populations in order to sort of continue population growth and to continue neighborhood health and longevity as neighborhoods are changing and as we're seeing sustained growth. So we have two images here, and this just sort of shows the changes over time between 2012 and 2016, and then 2017 and 2021. And we're just seeing more and more of our CSAs where we're seeing a rise in population here. And another place we're seeing a population changes in the aging population in the city of Baltimore. From 2012 to 2016 to 2017 and 2021, the percentage of the population 65 years or older increased in Baltimore from 12.3% to 14.1%. And if we see on these images, a lot of that population change is occurring in sort of the northwestern parts of the city, up in this corner over here where you have Howard Park and Dorchester Ashburton. And I think it's important to identify where these demographic changes are happening, because these are parts of the city we don't necessarily think about as incredibly accessible, or where there's a lot of mobility between one neighborhood or the rest of the city. But our aging population has different mobility challenges than other spaces too. So we need to begin to think about what are the needs of those communities and begin planning for this sort of aging population in our northwestern parts of the city. All right, moving into housing and community development. So I am going to be totally honest here and say that the housing work that Binya has done is very new to me. And I know that my predecessor had a ton of experience in housing policy and analysis. So I am still catching up here. So I pulled out some indicators that I found interesting. They might be new to you, but hopefully they get some conversation started. So one thing we noticed between 2010 and 2020 is that the percentage of residential properties that were owner occupied in Baltimore decreased from 60% to 52.6%. And in the Community Change Project, we dove into those trends in a bit more depth. I was actually looking at some early Binya planning documents this morning and noticed that one of the long-term goals that we set as an institution when we got started in the 2000s was increasing the number of properties that were owner occupied. And I think the sort of percentage we set was kind of 50% or so. So we got above that for that 60% for the city, but we're seeing some declines. And I think it's sort of worth pulling out that the average for the city is a lot different than what we see in some parts of the city where, the rates of owner occupancy sort of start high and stay high, or they have a little bit of fluctuation. Whereas in other parts of the city, Southwest and Madison East End, they start on the lower side and continue to go lower. And this is the sort of big pandemic indicator that we can see in the housing data set, and that's median days on the market. It should not be a surprise to any of you that Baltimore got caught up in the housing market frenzy that defined the pandemic to a certain degree. And we see that in our indicators. Between 2020 and 2021, the median number of days that a house was listed on the market in Baltimore decreased from 23 to 14. If we look at that from 2010 to 2021, that went from 100 days to 14 days. Huge. Obviously, there are market forces that were at work in that, and it'll be interesting to see how the sort of median days on the market shifts into 2022 and 2023 as interest rates have risen. But that sort of 2021 was rapid turnover of houses. And this was a rather sobering indicator for me, which is the affordability index. And this measures the percent of households paying more than 30% income on housing. So I've brought up this sort of the map from 2012 to 2016 and then 2017 to 2021 here. And during that time frame, overall, the number of people who are paying more than 30% of their total household income has declined. That's good. But the other hand is if you look at the indexes at the bottom, you'll see that a higher percentage of households are there are more who are paying more than 30% of their income. So what I mean here is that while we've seen overall decreases in those who are paying more than 30%, the problem is becoming exacerbated for some communities. So in 2012 to 2016, the sort of range we had at the upper end was 44.8% to 51%. And now we're seeing the sort of top range of communities with this who are paying more than 30% up to 60%. It's a really big increase in some places. And that trend also plays out in terms of affordability for rent. So those who are renting, there's at least one CSA where over 80%, that's Southeastern, where over 80% of residents who are renters pay more than 30% of their total household income on rent. So we're seeing overall reductions in those who are living amongst those constraints, but we're seeing it exacerbated far more frequently and at higher rates. And then finally, in our housing section, between 2020 and 2021, we saw a decline in the percentages of homes that received vacant housing notice in Baltimore City. That's pretty much an all-time low. I think we can talk about that at greater depth of what those numbers might mean. When we sort of dig into what was going on the ground, we see that there were areas of the city where there were a lot of vacants that were taken down or renoed or refurbed one way or another that sort of accounted for that bigger decrease. But we also have to think moving forward is, what is the pipeline for houses entering vacancy now? All right. And moving on to crime and safety. I think this is a great indicator and chart to show why local data matters, especially when we're talking about big public, or we're talking about talking points that get repeated in the news or nationally about what's going on with crime in Baltimore. So between 2020 and 2021, the crime rate, the Part 1 crime rate did increase slightly. But we see that it increased slightly from a pandemic low. And I think that context is important here. And it shows you the importance of sort of placing data into the context in which this happens. Doesn't mean that we're not experiencing crime in the city. It doesn't mean that, currently we are experiencing sort of increase in property related crimes, but we need to put those numbers in context with the sort of the overall trajectory. It's going to be really interesting to see how these numbers play out over 2022 and then 2023 as well, whether we sort of rise back to pre-pandemic levels and which communities see rises and falls within that change. And then the last thing I'm going to focus on in the crime and safety section is this number of automobile accident calls per 1,000 residents. I am a city resident. I walk a lot of places. I know that I've seen a lot more automobile accidents just in my daily life. And between 2020 and 2021, we did see an increase in the number of automobile accident calls. Now, few qualifiers on this. This was both an increase from a pandemic decline, from about 75 calls per 1,000 residents for the city. But we are also approaching a high so the sort of high on that rate that we have in our data is 91.3 calls per 1,000 residents, and we are approaching that in 2021 with 89.8. It's also just sort of worth mentioning that the CSAs with the highest rates are adjacent to highways and major interstate highways. And those roads have crashes more frequently, but they also contain our arterial routes and have higher traffic density overall. So they have higher speeds compared to city streets and avenues. So worth kind of keeping in context, but I think also worth identifying that we are seeing an increase in automobile accident calls that is spiking even with pandemic declines. All right, workforce and economic development. So this is a graph from the longitudinal employer household dynamics database showing that between 2019 and 2020, so not 2021 in this case, the number of jobs in Baltimore decreased. And I think this is a good graphic just to sort of show how employment trends are going on in the city, but also points to sometimes being a data needs additional context beyond what we are able to provide from our different data sources. So a really good example of here is the percent of population employed 2017 to 2021. So I've been mentioning date ranges a lot in this conversation. You might be wondering why we're using date ranges, especially when we're comparing, as I did in other slides, to 2012 and 2016. And those are 5-year estimates from the American Community Survey. And that's sort of the best way that we can compare change over time using those estimates. There's more people who participate in those surveys across the 5 years, and it just gets us a more accurate count for what we're looking at. But a 5-year estimate from 2017 to 2021 isn't going to get you that sort of in the weeds detail of employment that might be really important for seeing pandemic effects. So we can sort of say that based on our indicators, based on using the ACS data, that the percentage of employed working age city residents increased from 61.6% to 65.6% during that time period. But if we want to dive in a little deeper, we can go to a source like the St. Louis Federal Reserve to sort of show what happened in the sort of early months of 2020 and what did we see across 2021. So there's a little gray bar on the screen. That is March 2020. And then that peak in May 2020 was sort of peak unemployment around 10 or so percent. And then we see a decline with some peaks and valleys in there, sort of returning to a decade-long low in 2023. Again, this is not at the community or neighborhood level, but sometimes it's worth sort of bringing in additional context to, understand that we might not be able to capture what those unemployment trends look like for someone during the pandemic. And so we can sort of use those data sources to comment on one another and provide some additional context. So this was the first chapter that I wrote for Vital Signs this year and was quite possibly my favorite chapter in the whole report. And I say this because I actually think it's where we can see the pandemic effects most strongly in Vital Signs. So from 2020 to 2021, the number of arts-related businesses in Baltimore City declined from 0.5 to 2.5 per 1,000 residents. But the CSAs that had the largest rates of art-related businesses, downtown Seton Hill, Midtown, Harbor East, places we associate with sort of the arts economy in the city, those were also the CSAs with the largest declines in art-related businesses. So these were our neighborhoods that were hardest hit by the pandemic. They are still they have the highest rates, but they were really hard hit. And we know that downtown Seton Hill lost numerous theaters, galleries, cultural institutions. We lost both workers and businesses. Year to year comparisons are a bit challenging for the workforce data in this domain, but I think it's really important to see to sort of follow this closely over the next few years and see if those jobs rebound, to see if our theaters and our galleries are able to sort of recover in this, and we can kind of identify where those target neighborhoods are as we monitor that. On the bright side, between 2020 and 2021, the number of publicly funded murals in Baltimore City increased from 382 to 444, which is very exciting. And in that time period, 7 communities gained 3 or more murals. We actually have a list of the CSAs that don't have any murals. So if you're looking, you can go to our website and sort of see where a community that might need a mural. But this was really a bright spot. And again, it makes sense in the context of the pandemic. You could be distanced while doing a mural. There were grant funds and other sort of support for artists to do this type of work. And we sort of see that represented in this large increase in murals in that 2020 to 2021 timeframe. So education and youth in schools. For this particular section, I'm going to highly recommend that you travel to our website and read this whole chapter. Our assistant director at BNEA, Cheryl Knott, wrote this chapter and did a phenomenal job of putting city school data into the context of what was actually going on in the schools. I don't want to dive too fully into what we did see sort of across the board, again, trying to stay more high level. But this is another area of the report where we did see sort of substantial declines that we can sort of identify were related to the pandemic. And I think this is most evident in the percent of students that were chronically absent or missing from school days. These percentages have increased in both elementary, middle, and high school students. I only have elementary and high school, which is on the next slide. But the number from elementary school that was chronically absent was across the city, 37.1%, and in some neighborhoods as high as 59%. It increases in high school, where over 50% of students across the city were chronically absent. And there have been particular gains with schools seeing rises from 2018 to 2019 into the present day with chronically absent students. Again, I think we can see that this is likely a consequence of pandemic, of distance learning, of an ever-changing school environment, but it's an important indicator for sort of thinking through what are the interventions to stem some of that chronic absenteeism. All right, we are on the last indicator, and we are just about at 15 minutes for Q&A, so I've somehow timed this right. I'm happy about that. So we're going to dive into sustainability. And here, I want to sort of draw attention to the percentage of employed populations with travel time to work, both 30 to 44 minutes and then 44 minutes and above. And the rates of percent of employed populations who are traveling to work within these ranges has slightly increased, and then it increased from 19.6% to 20% during that 2017 to 2021 range. So what this means is that people are spending more time driving and commuting to work in this city, or they are taking the bus with longer commute times, but we're seeing sort of rising rates of the times that people spent on their commutes. I think there's actually a really good opportunity here to sort of look at work from home impacts on this. This isn't necessarily represented in our data, but it is an area to dive deeper to sort of understand broader trends that are going on. But again, this is another interesting map where we see that there are certain neighborhoods like Greater Rosemont, Greater Mondawmin, and Sedonia, Frankfurt, where the percentage of the employed population traveling to work can be as high as 43% in some cases. And here in Edmondson Village, we have 40.8% travel 45 minutes or more to work every day. This is a basic quality of life issue. If you have a long commute, be that public transit or be it via car, it's a lot of time out of your day. It's a lot less time spent in the city. And it points to a sort of basic quality of life issue that is facing a lot of our neighborhoods across the city. And this is just a good visualization of how sort of those with lower travel times, so sort of within that 0 to 14 minutes, how they are connected by bike lanes and sort of transit mobility or pedestrian transit infrastructure. We see that we have a very disconnected system in that, and that it primarily benefits those who already have shorter commutes to work. And this is kind of my favorite graphic, which isn't even in our sustainability section. It's actually in our workforce and economic development section. But 55% of Baltimore City residents commute to work outside of the city. This percentage fluctuates slightly from year to year, but it hasn't dipped below 53% in 10 years. For some of our CSAs like Brooklyn Curtis Bay or Morrill Park, Violetville, that number is above 70%. Now, those communities are closer to the county line. There might be, reasons and sort of proximity relations for why they are working outside of the city. But we see across the city, we see about 50% of residents leave every day to go to work. This is kind of backwards in how we think about urban planning, where we think about cities as places of economic concentration and activity. Normally cities are the center, not the periphery. And that's not what we see going on for those who live in Baltimore. And even in downtown, in Midtown, in areas that have greater walkability, are serviced by bike lanes, do have pedestrian transit, close to 50% of residents, 45.6%, are leaving to work every day. Again, this comes down to a quality of life issue for residents across the city. So I think it's important to sort of contextualize those long commute times. With nearly half of the workforce seeking jobs outside of the city's borders. I think we can understand these as legacy effects of segregationist policies, where our outer core, our formerly redlined areas, experience the sort of long-term neglect of civic infrastructure, of economic development, and of reliable transit. These are the low-hanging fruit of things that we can improve to enhance neighborhood life, this sort of commute times, walkability, building a city that you can live and work in. I think those are the kind of next steps, and we need to think about them systemically across our neighborhoods and prioritize the communities that have experienced the greatest burdens over time to really address these core issues that are facing our city. So that is my slides on vital signs. I know that that was a lot of indicators, but I am happy to open the Q&A to the chat. And Cheryl, I don't know if there were any questions that came up as I was talking, or if someone wants to come off mute. I'm happy to go either way on the Q&A.
So in regards to that last slide, Michael posted a question about the percentage of folks that are commuting out of the city for work. So Michael asks, isn't that a function of loss of business in the city?
It could be. I think that there's a lot to dive into on this, and it's work that I'm hoping we can do at BINIA. We need to get a better sense of our regional dynamics. We know that there are groups and people from certain areas that come into the city to work, either from the county, surrounding Baltimore County or our other counties. So we know that there's influx. We know that there are people who work in the city. But we also don't know where people in the city work. Some groups have begun to do this work, and the data does exist to sort of do this at a regional scale. I think that's something we're interested in. And perhaps we see that business loss is sort of a causal factor in this, but I don't think it's the only thing driving it. Any other questions?
And folks, please feel free to put them in the chat. Oh, here we have another one from Holly Dalton, who works with Baltimore City Public Schools. What are examples of some other key indicators related to education and youth that are available? And are there any other high-level insights to share beyond percent of students chronically absent?
Cheryl, would you want to answer this question?
So a lot of our education and youth indicators that we include in our vital signs report are derived from city schools. So we're grateful to have that partnership to receive data and information. So we look at both chronic absenteeism, and so we break this out, of course, elementary, middle, and high, but we also look at changes in overall enrollment in addition to that attendance. We have in the past been able to look at test performance and look at this really at the neighborhood level of where students live versus necessarily looking at the data in ways that other researchers do, which is based on school location. So Baltimore City obviously has school of choice for middle schoolers and high schoolers. So you can have students kind of traveling all throughout the city to go from home to school and vice versa. So we have used test performance data as a way of, being able to track and describe longitudinally trends that we can see in neighborhoods. But with some of the changes that have been going on, at Bina, when I first started working here, we were looking at, one different data set relating to tests, standardized tests. It got updated a few years ago. We were looking at that park data. So we want to make sure that we're able to look really consistently and across time and comparably. So test performance has been like a little trickier one for us. And then obviously with COVID, this has definitely had an impact on some of our measures. So this is something that we're open to discussing with policy researchers. We're aware of lots of folks, especially at Hopkins, that are delving into this to really expand and build upon this suite of indicators so that we can really start thinking about data sets that can measure what's going on with young people. One of the things that we are also, just interested in potentially, and this could be a larger research project, not necessarily something for vital signs, but focusing in on that experience of traveling to school for young people. So we have a lot of opportunities there. So we have a couple other questions. So Jim asks, is it possible to disaggregate any of the indicators from the CSA level to that more specific neighborhood that comprise them?
Jim, that is a great question. And I also think we can piggyback with that second question in the chat, which is about the challenges of finding data at the census tract or neighborhood level. So we use the CSA level in order for communities to be comparable. That neighborhood level on its own is just too small to really look at trends across the city. But we do occasionally, we do projects where we can sort of pull out the neighborhood geographies and then look at the data at that level. So we do that occasionally for different projects or for different organizations who might be looking for that sort of better neighborhood picture. So that data wouldn't necessarily be comparable year to year or across the city. Well, it's comparable longitudinally, but not comparable sort of geographic wise. And we can do that. So it's really a question of what's the project, what are its goals, and what questions are we trying to answer, and sort of looking at the neighborhood level. I do think tomorrow at Data Week, we're going to have some people from planning who might not be directly talking about the neighborhood update map, but we'll be able to sort of talk about the updates they've made on the geographies on the neighborhood map at the city level. And the question that follows that is about the challenges of finding data at the census tract or neighborhood level outside of ACS. So as that word cloud that I showed mentioned, ACS and census are really kind of our biggest data sources on a lot of our indicators. For many other ones, for the Info USA data, for ones that we might acquire, they typically, and Cheryl can correct me if I'm wrong, have different geographies, and then we will sort of match them to our CSA boundaries, and that takes some work on our end, but we have a method. It's pretty polished, and we can aggregate it fairly successfully. And that's the same with publicly available data sources as well. Cheryl has been here for over 16 years, so I think knows the ins and outs and the quirks of the data that we get and what sort of analysis might need to be done at that geographic level to make it all work. So if there are specific mapping questions, that is her domain. And one thing I just want to say really quickly is while I was presenting on vital signs today, vital signs is really an effort of our whole staff. Both Cheryl, who answered the question on education, as well as Logan and Ashley, who are also on this call. This is a product of our whole organization. We all edit it together. We bounce ideas off of each other. We all have different understandings and discussions of the data to share and provide. And all of our staff is such a great resource for sort of talking through these things.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. So I just want to mention really quickly, I dropped a link in the chat. So if you would love to get into the weeds of geography and some of the technical pieces, be sure to check out a mapping resources open data portal that I created, I think last year. I don't know, time's a weird thing. So if you're interested in how census tracts relate to the community statistical areas or CSAs, we have crosswalk files there so you can see which census tracts then comprise the CSAs. Neighborhoods are a really interesting thing for us to think about because they're, defined by the people that live within them. This is a process that the planning department goes through every decade to figure out, okay, what is this neighborhood called? What are its boundaries? And so when we do some of our work, we try to do some best fit to figure out, again, how do these neighborhoods relate to CSAs? And on that portal, we do have kind of the result, that input of our best fit analysis to figure out how to relate these things to one another. But again, our community statistical areas, we've got 55 of these. They're really good for just looking at data across time, but we recognize that they can sometimes be big and unwieldy. So I'm dropping my email in the chat if folks want to, like I said, follow up, geek out with me about boundaries, about technical ways of calculating this data and information. But we hope that those CSAs can be like that really good starting point for thinking about, what trends can we see across time in the city, but then also within some of these like larger clusters of approximate census tracts and neighborhoods.
There's a question in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing. There's a question in the chat about new indicators or how we create additional indicators to add to vital signs. This is a great question. This year, we did not add any new indicators to vital signs. I started and Cheryl was like, you must do the vital signs. And it was just a ramp to get it done, a really rapid on ramp. So there wasn't even time for me to sort of structurally step back and think, maybe there's something new to add to this report. But what I can say is our indicators reflect community concerns and community needs and desires. That's kind of a starting point when it comes to indicators. As I sort of mentioned earlier, indicators point, right? And we want them to point to something meaningful and measurable for communities. We also have quite a long list of the characteristics needed to become an indicator. I think it's like 2 pages long. And that's kind of a very rigorous framework that we bring to say, is this something that we could track decade to decade? Is there a reliable data source that we can depend upon to get this data? Is this something that's relevant to all neighborhoods in Baltimore? There are other characteristics, but those are sort of our guiding features. And this is to say that there is a world of data available and accessible and that we work with that never become an indicator just because they don't really fit those qualifications. And so one thing is if there's an indicator you're looking for, let's talk. Let's talk and see if it's in the data and if it's something that can kind of fit what we're looking for in an indicator. That's how new indicators get started. The sort of second point, and something that I'm really interested in this role of director, is figuring out what the data needs of communities are and leveraging BINIA expertise to be able to identify data sets that might be relevant to a few communities, but maybe not relevant to all of the city, and just describe what's in them, give you some best use cases, describe how this can be used, how it can be compared, but maybe not elevate it to the status of an indicator. I think there's a lot of opportunity for this, engaging youth and engaging some of our media partners in the city to tell really interesting data stories with civic and administrative data that maybe just doesn't get as much discussion as kind of the big ones or the easily standardizable ones. And Jim, thank you for sort of pointing to that the initial set of BINIA indicators came from focus groups and community folks. So there was an organizing momentum of a lot of institutions in the city. And I'm not going to be able to list the full list, but it included Enoch Pratt, it included CHAP, it included NEKC sort of on the ground, trying to see what indicators groups would want over time. And I guess the sort of other thing to add is we've had indicators that we can't track anymore, that data is no longer available to us or is not tracked in a way that we can aggregate, that it's a living document, and that sometimes our indicators, despite our best efforts, are not as long-lived as we would hope. So it is a constant and evolving set of data and indicators, but it starts from the community.
And I'd just like to mention, so this is actually an opportunity for us. So BINIA does go through this process every few years. So I think it's happened twice in my 16 years that I've been here. So, we tried to get folks together, get all the experts on housing to talk about the housing data, the crime data experts to talk about the crime data, and for us to really get as much feedback as possible. We're always open to having conversations, suggestions, but sometimes, having everyone in the same place at the same time to talk about things like we're doing for Baltimore Data Day is just a great way for conversations to build off of one another, suggestions to build. And so I think we have an opportunity with Amanda, at the helm of BINIA to be able to reconvene these conversations and figure out again, like what is going to be the most meaningful and actionable data sets for neighborhoods, for stakeholders, for other researchers that are working here in Baltimore. So we really appreciate folks that, join us for events like this, appreciate folks that are coming to join us tomorrow, because we would not be able to do this work. This work would not be meaningful without all of the work of what makes BINIA a true alliance in the data and community world. So thank you.
All right, we are just almost at one. Truly cannot believe that timing worked out. Whew. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but my email is always open. But I want to sort of close on a final note, which is to say, for those who are attending Baltimore Data Day tomorrow in person, this is the energy that we want to see. These are the conversations and questions that we hope you will ask not only us and the BINIA team, but all of our panelists. We are so excited to get people together in person to talk about Baltimore data and all the exciting programs and projects that are going on. So bring your inquisitiveness, bring your passion. We are so excited for tomorrow and look forward to meeting you all if you're coming and in the future if not. So have a great rest of your day, everyone.